Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Great Man's Lady from 1942. And this is continuing my quest to review as much of the filmography of William Wellman as I possibly can. The Great Man's Lady was the first collaboration between William Wellman and Barbara Stanwyck since their great many pre-Code films. They hadn't worked together in almost 10 years, I'd say like 8 or 9 years. Stanwyck was always William Wellman's favorite actor. He loved working with her, more so than any of the other actors he worked with. He worked with her, I think, more than anybody else. This film and Ladies of Burlesque would end up being their last collaborations together. And at first, when you hear of someone getting together with someone after a long period of time, I think especially now when we think of Hollywood films, they try to recapture some of that magic in a similar way that we're used to seeing it. And The Great Man's Lady isn't like that at all. The Great Man's Lady is very much a film from the 40s, whereas all of Stanwyck and Wellman's collaborations before were very much films of the early 30s, of the pre-Code 30s. And this is very much Hollywood, very much in the Hays Code at the time, and a lot more censored and not as liberal as it certainly was before. And especially having just reviewed Female and now reviewing The Great Man's Lady, it becomes a lot more clear to me how what's often said about pre-Code is how actresses at that time would be cast in roles of women who had power, who had more control over their lives, who it was their own choice, who weren't overshadowed by a man. And then, Wellman and Stanwyck get to work together again after all that, and the film's called The Great Man's Lady. And it's really about a woman in the shadow of this other guy who no one knew about, and how a lot of this film is about her character yelling at this guy and putting him in his place and steering him in the right direction. It feels less like the individual, the strong woman. And she's still a strong woman, but I don't think she's as much of herself. She's as much defined by this guy as she is herself, and I don't think you would have seen that before. And it really kind of showed to me, especially the order I'm watching. This filmography is all over the place, mostly because of availability and such, but it really highlights to me the difference between these two eras and how women were perceived in those two different eras. I wouldn't say this is like a strict genre woman's picture, but I guess that's kind of what you would put it in. And it shows me the difference between women's pictures in the 30s and the 40s, and it doesn't look that great while watching The Great Man's Lady. It doesn't feel as empowering as those films do. It doesn't make me feel as hopeful for the past. It makes me see how everything was so confined. And it also shows how different they'd even show the story of early America to the present time in this film, and how it was less about the adventure of it and got you less into it. Really kind of felt a little more soap opera-y, had to do that to make that story compelling, whereas another film I saw recently that's a Wellman film from the early 30s, The Conquerors, is far more about the adventure of it, the determination, and it's a group of people, and this is almost like the guy gets to go off and do everything and get the glory, and everyone else is kind of forgotten except for this great man. And I think the morals of this film certainly hold it back, but also it's soap opera storytelling as well. It just kind of makes you a little sick of the whole 40s in general. I think shows more of the weakness in that period, unlike the previous Wellman-Stanwyck collaborations, which showed the pros of the previous period. There's a statue being put up in Hoyt City of Ethan Hoyt on his horse, and it's this big statue, and they want to learn about Hannah Hoyt, a woman who was very much in the shadows, who knew a lot about this guy, who was married to him for a time, and was one of the people who made Hoyt City the big metropolis we can see it is at the beginning of the film. All these newspaper men, after seeing the unveiling of the statue, run to her house. Why they didn't do this before, so the story could come out the day the statue's unveiled, which would technically make a lot more sense, but let's just go with it. They go to her house, and all these newspaper people want to talk to her, but then this one female news reporter talks to her and says she's a biographer, she's worked on various biographies, and she'd love to talk to her, and they strike up a conversation, and she tells the story of her life with Ethan Hoyt and how they eventually became married, and how she became Hannah Hoyt, and how she was arranged to be married to him, how he would run off to find money to help build Hoyt City, and how that all eventually happened through her perspective, telling it to this female biographer. And at this point, Hannah Hoyt is actually 107 years old, which I don't know how realistic that was at that time, but Barbara Stanwyck is definitely able to play that sort of an age range. You do really get a sense of how long ago it was and how much has changed since then, albeit in a very soap opera way. 1942 wasn't like the early 30s. World War II had already started. And in fact, this film was actually held back for a year because Paramount wanted to release The Fleet's Inn, which they felt was more timely and time specific, so this film actually got delayed. So I don't actually know if this film was made before or after Roxy Hart. It was kind of a 1-2 punch of this film and then Lady of Burlesque right in a row, so I'm not sure exactly if Wellman and Stanwyck worked together right in a row. But it was a very different era, and it's a very different Hollywood, and they were both at a different studio, Paramount, whereas before they were at Warner's. And you definitely see the difference. And Wellman was a different director at this point. Oxbow, I think, was on the shelf at this time. He wasn't as into being a studio director in the 40s as he was in the 30s. Wellman still found movies that I think are really great, like Roxy Hart is probably one of his greatest of the 40s, and Oxbow and Yellow Sky and Reaching for the Sun. But then when you would have to do films like this, they felt even more typical. They felt like being a studio director, you couldn't slip as much in. Like, they were more cautious of their films at the time. And The Great Man's Lady reeks of that, and it doesn't have as much fun. There's certain shots you can tell that direction-wise they're getting a little more into. How tapered down this film is, and also how melodramatic and soap opera-y it is. It does feel like we're moving from soap opera story point to soap opera story point throughout this film. And it doesn't feel as exciting and as inviting, really, as other films about history that Wellman has directed. I almost feel like he was more concerned with wowing the audience with this melodrama than telling them the story of Ethan and Hannah Hoyt and everything that happened between them. And I'm not sure if that was a studio decision or what, but it definitely makes this film a lot less enjoyable. The melodrama makes them less relatable, because soap opera's fun to get interested in and as a guilty pleasure and be like, can't believe he did that with her. And there's a lot of that in this, but there's not as much concern like, oh my god, I can't believe they did that back then. This film isn't concerned with that as much. I don't really care about Hoyt City. I'm assuming that's a real city and such. It doesn't really hit me that way. It kind of just makes me go, okay. And also the fact that he is such a shitty guy and she believes in him and believes in Hoyt City happening and ends up helping make it happen. Joel McCrea, who I actually think is actually fairly good in this role, at least able to play a character who's not as sure of himself, feels like he's moving from one era of history to another, playing off of his cluelessness and how ready and eager he is to give up. Joel McCrea was actually fairly good at that. And I like Stanwyck as well. I think Stanwyck plays a huge age range, similar to what she did in So Big, but I think she plays more of the age range in this film. And they're both great actors, and even Brian Donnelly as well. But I don't particularly like her just every now and then just going no, you're wrong, this is what you should do, and just sets him off on the right course. It feels like she's too much of an outsider and not enough of a participant in the story. She's supposed to be the great man's lady, but we almost don't get as into that. It's interesting to see a perspective of somebody who's rates, whether it's man or whatever, life through someone else's perspective, but they don't really play into that, and you get somewhat about her life and how hard it was for her. Seeing her be so holden back by this kind of shitty guy isn't as relatable. Apparently Wellman and Stanwyck felt this was some of their best work, which I don't really understand. In fact, a lot of the times, a lot of the film's really done in darkness, and it doesn't feel like, at least the copy I saw, it didn't differentiate between the blacks and the whites enough, and it was felt a little murky, and there are times turned off all the lights. I was like, what is going on right now? I could kind of tell, but I couldn't really tell. Having this film be so between, there's a love triangle, she has babies that he doesn't know about, he gets married to another woman because he thinks she's dead. I feel like when you have these older films about people building a town or building something and life changing, it's about the way it worked best with Wellman was when it was about a group, and you see the group change and certain people die off, and how these people get older and how they've stayed together all this time and how they have a nice little family. And then in this film, it's kind of about that, but it's mainly about this guy. You don't really get a sense of the group together, so it's just a bunch of people who did go through life together but aren't as connected in some ways. There's kind of a through line, but it feels all sorts of jagged throughout. And I like when Wellman shows characters through various time periods and shows how they've been destroyed by those time periods. And this again feels more melodramatic, more soap opera-y through that. It's kind of the more melodramatic Wellman than we're used to. It doesn't feel as humble. It feels like it's kind of playing more for what a studio melodrama wants, and it almost feels unnatural. It doesn't feel like it works together particularly well. And I don't really like this movie too much. The 40s begin a period for Wellman. I think the 30s are probably what's considered to be Wellman's best decade, and probably will always be as such. But then when you get into the 40s and the 50s, he doesn't feel like he's as interested in being a studio director anymore. He doesn't feel like he's as challenged by it. It almost feels like a master craftsman studio director that's just showing up to do his job. And he still was inspired in this period. Like, literally the film before Roxy Hart, I think, is a very underrated Wellman film, which is very satirical and interesting. But he'd go from doing things like Roxy Hart and Oxbow Incident that are very subversive and interesting and thought-provoking, and then he does things like The Great Man's Lady and Buffalo Bill and This Man's Navy and Thunderbirds, which are kind of just forgettable studio fare. It felt like in the 30s and before, he would get more interested in doing forgettable studio fare, and he liked to be doing different types of films. And I think as he became an older director and as he was just like doing a picture a year no matter what, he was just like kind of going into these things, and especially the history films he did, like The Gallant's Journey and things like that, he didn't feel as inspired as he was before. But this one particularly, I feel like he didn't feel like as innovative in it. He didn't feel like he was having as much fun with the camera. The things he was doing with the camera were kind of bad ideas entirely, and the theory behind them didn't necessarily work. Certain melodrama does work in Wellman's films, but it works in more of a humble, understanded way that kind of works for the characters, and this just felt like they were getting hit with one thing after another. It didn't feel like a natural progression of history. It felt like when you're watching a soap opera and like someone drives off a cliff or something like that. The Great Man's Lady is probably Wellman's only real soap opera melodrama. It kind of shows why maybe he wasn't really the best at doing that. I love seeing Stanwyck in anything, but this is probably one of the worst films I've seen her in. This is definitely the worst Wellman film I've seen her in. And it's kind of sad that they actually thought this was like really good, and they were sad that the public wasn't really into it. But I have to side with the public on this one because it was just a little too much in what it was trying to do. It was trying to bank on the success of a Cecil B. DeMille film, Union Pacific, because it had Joel McCrea and Barbara Stanwyck, who were both in that film. But this is nothing like that. Like, that made me interested in the railroad and watching a film I didn't think I would be able to sit through and really interested me. And this is a film, Wellman was in it, Stanwyck was in it, I was really ready and I was there. And it ended up boring me in how like melodramatic and soap opera it was, and not as humble and interested in really complimenting its main female protagonist. It felt like more interested in beating her down, and felt how great her endurance was. And after a while, like, that's not the most fun thing to watch. It made me just really feel bad for her and feel bad for Stanwyck and Wellman for directing something like this. So if you have seen The Great Man's Lady and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my William Wellman review playlist. There will be an annotation below. If you are a fan of William Wellman, I have reviewed over 50 William Wellman films, and they're all in that playlist. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.